Hi, I'm Pastor Steve Talmage of Love of Christ Lutheran Church in Mesa, Arizona. And each week, Pastor Nanette Christofferson and I try to provide a brief introduction to two of the assigned lectionary readings for the upcoming Sunday. In this lesson, we're going to look at the Gospel for the first Sunday in Advent, Sunday, November 27th, 2022. It's Matthew 24, 36 through 44. As we begin a new church calendar year, we're going to enter into the Gospel of Matthew. Will be our primary gospel, with other readings from the Gospel of John. Just a little introduction to Advent. Advent is the name given to this season that we're starting. It's a season of 24 days leading up to Christmas, so that's why in Advent calendars you only have 24 windows to open. The word Advent is derived from the Latin word adventus, which means coming. The waiting and anticipation undertaken during Advent symbolize not only the waiting for Christ's birth, but also for his final return. And our lesson for this coming Sunday, the first Sunday, is about his final return. Within the church, this period is observed as an Advent season of anticipation and preparation for the coming of Jesus Christ on Christmas. In other words, Advent intentionally sets time aside to pause, thoughtfully reflect on the nativity story and its impact in the midst of the world that seems to rush through the holidays faster and faster each year. So we'll start with the second coming of Jesus, then we'll move toward the first coming of Jesus, and then we end Advent anticipating and ready to prepare for the celebration of his birth at Christmas. Matthew 24 and 25, let's put it in the context of the gospel. It's Holy Week. Jesus is coming in and out of Jerusalem. He has spoken about the fall of Jerusalem and his return in judgment. And this our gospel reading for this week is a section of Jesus' final sermon about what to expect, what to anticipate. Let's take a look and begin to unwrap this lesson for Sunday. Verse 36, but about that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. This is a warning to his disciples, to his audience, to his listeners, to Matthew's readers, to us. No one knows when the second coming of Jesus will be. No one knows, but only God. So, when characters throughout history have calculated and pinpointed and prophesied and said, this year or this day is when it's going to happen, you know they haven't been reading Matthew 24:36, and you know they haven't been listening to Jesus, because no one knows but only the Father. And part of that is Jesus is saying, let's fixate not on when the second coming is going to be, know it's going to happen, but let's fixate and focus on the here and now, right now, and how we're living our lives in the here and now, not sitting around waiting for what's next. 37 through 39. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. So we have this, reference. Again, Matthew's gospel had not been written when Jesus was giving this sermon. The New Testament wasn't a reality in the time of Jesus. And so the only scriptures that the people of God had were their Jewish scriptures, our Old Testament. And they would know this story of Noah and the story of the ark and the story of the flood and all of that. They would know that story. And Jesus again is using a story that they would have been taught, they would have heard, they would have known, and reminds them that all of us are to be living in a state of readiness, of preparedness, of awareness, of intentionality. But in Noah's day, the people neglected God. They didn't listen to God. They didn't look for God. And they went about their daily lives doing whatever they did, eating, drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, as if we have all the time in the world. And then the flood came and disaster happen. There is a point here that we need to constantly be reminded that we have today, nothing is guaranteed tomorrow, and that we have a responsibility in the midst of our eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, to recognize who gives us our daily bread, who gives us our daily breath, and live with an attitude of gratitude and a mindfulness and awareness of how God would have us use the lives that God has given us. Then we get this wonderful passage that folks have blown way out of proportion. 40 to 41. Then 2 will be in the field. 1 will be taken. 1 will be left. 2 women will be grinding meal together. 1 will be taken and 1 will be left. There has been a whole industrial Christian authorship complex created around this passage of Scripture. And I just want to unwrap this whole idea of the rapture. The idea of rapture, as it is currently defined, this idea of somebody being snatched up to heaven and others left behind, is not found in historic Christianity, and is a relatively recent doctrine. It was developed by John Nelson Darby in the 19th century, and it got lots of traction with certain branches of Christianity, and boy, in our 20th century, mid to late 20th century, it's gotten lots of traction. And people have made millions of dollars off of, helping people get ready for the rapture or be scared about the rapture. Let me stress here, most Christian denominations, including Lutherans, do not hold to the idea that Christians will be raptured prior to Jesus' second coming, leaving the rest of humanity to suffer horribly under a 1,000-year reign of sin and terror. We haven't taught that. We don't preach that. That is not what Scripture supports. So what is Jesus talking about then, if he's not talking about what Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins in the Left Behind series, put out 12 books and movies about? What is Jesus talking about? Think about modern analogies. Analogies of Nazis snatching Jews from their workplace or home, or immigration officers detaining and deporting undocumented workers. Jesus may be speaking to the reality of his day, where Roman authorities were in charge and they could come without warning and remove friends and family members for suspicion of treason. They probably were stories among the disciples of people they knew who were snatched away, not up into heaven, but by the authorities, by the occupation troops, by the powers that be. And so Jesus is letting people know the reality is there is no guarantee, particularly living in the first century, where death could come instantly, where arrest, where separation from family, where your job could be taken from you. All of that could happen. And you basically have no rights. You have no privileges because you're living under the empire. You're living under the Roman government. So 42, Jesus says, keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. So like those modern day analogies, like the reality of Jesus' day and the Roman occupation forces, Jesus says, just stay awake. Pay attention. And I don't believe Jesus is saying, oh, you got to stay awake 24/7 so you take these no-dose pills and caffeine and jack yourself up. But the whole idea is to live in a state of awareness, alertness, preparedness. Because as all of us know, life can change in an instant. Things can happen. Think of the pandemic and how just almost 3 years ago, our whole globe was transformed and turned upside down. How things just stopped and shut down. The idea of Jesus here is saying to his disciples, the end of the world, God's judgment, the second coming of the Son of Man, Jesus, will come. But you're not going to know when it is. You're never going to know when it is, because only God knows when it is. So live your life each day knowing it's coming, but not in fear or dread, but in anticipation, the Advent theme, of preparation, the Advent theme, and see it as a positive, where sin will be no more, where the kingdom of heaven will be on earth as it is in heaven. Verse 43, but understand this, if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Again, Jesus is trying to use some metaphors or analogies to help people understand that if you knew exactly when all this is going to play out, you would have no excuse because you've been foretold. And he stresses then in 44, therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. So trying to figure out how do I live in this state of readiness when I'm being told I don't know when it's going to be, but Jesus is saying I need to be ready. Well, I'm going to lean on a theologian, a scholar, Dr. Stanley Saunders. He says, this is not advice for crisis moments, but a call to perpetual normative readiness, regardless of circumstance. After all, for Christians living in the time of resurrection and the defeat of death, every moment is lived on the edge. Watchfulness or wakefulness is here not a defensive or preventive posture, but a heightened attentiveness attuned both to the signs of God's presence and power, as well as the signs that the powers of this world are doubling down. So we watch, we participate, we live our lives recognizing God is at work, God is in our midst, but also we recognize there are forces, there are powers, there are structures, there are systems that do not want to have the reign of God at work in the world. And so we watch, we participate, but ultimately, we as followers of Jesus have the assurance of the death and resurrection of Jesus, that there's nothing that's going to separate us from God's love. Saunders goes on to say, Christians do not know, cannot know, and are not supposed to know when the Lord is coming. This is a condition we are to embrace, not attempt to overcome. Watching and readiness are not meant to be switched on and off according to perceived need. These are, in fact, the disciplines to which Jesus calls his disciples more than any other as the end of his ministry draws near. You're living at the end, so stay awake and watch. And that's the emphasis of Advent. Stay awake, watch. Look for how God's going to play this out, particularly context of Holy Week, context of Jesus going to the cross, context of Easter, rising from the dead. Be awake, watch, see how God is going to bring the inbreaking of God's kingdom into the world, and trust that God will not abandon us forever, and trust that God is able to overcome all things through the witness of Jesus' death and resurrection. Well, enjoy the season of Advent. Reflect on the words of Jesus, and remember from this lesson, you're never going to know when Jesus is coming again, but he will. He will. And our job is to simply to be ready by the way we live our lives and pay attention to what's happening in the world around us, and seeing that God is present. Take care. God bless.